Welcome to the Lens of History. You are with Luke Herbert, speaking with special guests and placing the microscope on current and historical events.
Welcome to the second installment of programs that first aired on Another Punk podcast. In this discussion, I talk with Jack Hurst about his book Born to Battle, which covers the parallel lives of USS Grant and Nathan Bedford Forrest in the American Civil War, and it covers the battles they both unknowingly fought in together and what shaped each man's character, primarily their backgrounds. This program first aired in 2012. And in this discussion with Jack Hurst, I take an alternate view of the way Nathan Bedford Forrest was treated and the American Civil War, taken from an outsider's perspective. In fact, it's taken from the perspective of someone who has followed British Empire military history, particularly in World War I and World War II. We now join Luke Herbert and Jack Hurst in the Lens of History studio. So, how are you doing, Jack?
I'm doing fine, thank you. I'm very happy to be with you.
All right, and just before we get into the nitty-gritty of the book, I think I'm just going to give the listeners some details. And this book came out in 2012. It's published by Basic Books, and the ISBN number is 978-0465020188. But now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the book. And the central theme of your book is that it follows Grant and Nathan Bedford Forrest throughout the Civil War and in the Western Theatre, which in my opinion decided the conflict. And Grant is, he's able to eventually rise in rank throughout the war and has a relationship with Lincoln, whereby Forrest is treated as he's looked down upon by the ruling class in the South. So, moving along, after the Battle of Shiloh, Forrest takes part in what becomes known as a cavalry charge at Fallen Timbers. Now, do you think it's fair to say this was Forrest's making as a commander?
Well, I wouldn't say that. No, I think that he had already achieved some local renown in the earlier in the war. Actually his first battle around Christmas of 1861, he led a similar kind of charge at a little place called Sacramento, Kentucky, and he routed a detachment of Federal cavalry and then chased them for 2 miles, and they had people hanging from the saddles, and it was a pretty bloody affair. In that fight, he is supposed to have, killed or unhorsed 3 men with his own hands, and the commander to whom he filed his report, he didn't say that in his report, but his commanding officer did say that about him and sent the report on up to headquarters. And so it had made some, it had an effect at headquarters, because they realized that this man who had no military training whatsoever, obviously had some aptitude for war. And it's apparently the Western commander at that time, Albert Sidney Johnston, took note of that and found Forrest to be a pretty interesting character. I think it's notable that it was Albert Sidney Johnston who did that rather than anybody else along the line, because Albert Sidney Johnston had spent a lot of time before the war in Texas. And in fact, he had been part of the Lone Star Republic before it became a state, and so he was although he had been to West Point and was of the upper crust, at the same time he had rubbed shoulders with an awful lot of people in Texas who were probably of the same type Forrest was, at least, from the same level of society. And so, but then as after Shiloh, where Albert Sidney Johnston was killed, then a different class of upper crust took over, and these were the people who very much tended to look down on people like Forrest, who had, just sprung up from the bottom.
Well, I think it's worth actually taking a look at the sort of earlier lives of Grant and Forrest, and you make the point in the book that they came from similar backgrounds, although different parts of the United States. Grant naturally was more of a northerner, but they both came from the bottom of society in terms of the amount of money they were making, or they were poor, different ways you might want to describe it. But the interesting thing I found with that, at least, was that Forrest is able to become a successful businessman before the start of the American Civil War. He sells and recaptures slaves. He has other business interests, whereby Grant is the complete opposite, really. He's a failure in business, and at one point he had to sell his watch to give his kids Christmas presents. So what's the dividing line between the two men's characters that makes Nathan Bedford Forrest a success in business, but Grant not?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think, to me, the difference is, well, there are two differences. One, they were just, they had different turns of mind as men, but the other was, I think that their early situation was different. I mean, Grant, although they were, not well off by any means, they at least weren't in, his family was not in, financial chaos, which Forrest's was. When he turned 13 and his father lost the modest farm that they had in Middle Tennessee, and they were then forced to go and settle on a leased hill farm in North Mississippi, in an area that the Indians had just vacated, and so this was just wild frontier. And then soon after they got down there, Forrest's father died, and Forrest, as the eldest son, then had to become the breadwinner, and so his whole that was all very a stressful kind of beginning, whereas Grant's wasn't so successful. Stressful. And then second, Grant was a kind of person. He was more of an artistic kind of person. I mean, he didn't like the subjects that he had to study at West Point. He never wanted to go to West Point. He never wanted to be a soldier. That was never in his mind. It was just that his father wanted to get him a free education, and so he sent him there. But Grant really didn't care to be there, and he spent most of his time reading novels out of the West Point Library rather than his studies. That he had a good mind. I mean, he could read the lessons a time or two and get by very well in class. But he didn't like what he was studying, and so he read these novels, and he was also pretty talented as an artist, with a pencil drawing sketches and pictures. And Forrest's turn of mind was completely different. Forrest, and I think partly because of the stress of his early situation, he was riveted on just, the way he acted was that he seemed determined never to, to get out of that situation where he was not a landowner, and then to make sure that he never fell back into that situation. And he just seemed obsessed about it. And also his mind was more mathematical than it was artistic. And, he was better fitted for business in that way. Now, when Grant, after he left the Army between, the Mexican War and the Civil War, he didn't fail, like at farming, for instance, he didn't fail because of lack of effort. He failed because of the caprices of the weather and a financial panic that swept the country in 1857. And so, he was kind of a victim of circumstance there. Now, when he finally, just before the war landed, with his father's own firm, got a job in his father's own firm, he seems to have done all right there. I mean, it wasn't that he was not, that he didn't apply himself to business or anything like that. It was just that, that wasn't his all-consuming passion, and it really seemed to have been with Forrest. I mean, he was determined, to become wealthy. But it didn't seem that he wanted to become like the other members of the upper crust. He just wanted to have the same financial advantages of the upper crust. He never seemed ashamed of where he had come from, in other words, and neither did Grant. Forrest did, though. Forrest did. He was ashamed of the fact that he had a very meager education. He only got about 6 months formal schooling in his life, and he did feel uncomfortable about that. But that was the only thing. He didn't feel ashamed of the people he came from, or that sort of thing.
When I read your book, it comes across that Forrest very much came from more of a frontier life than Grant, and if he didn't, act in a certain way like Forrest did, they wouldn't have survived. I think you say in the book at one point, Forrest's mum refused to give up some baby chickens to some cougars, which I believe are a form of wild cat, for the benefit of our international listener, who were attacking them. So, if she'd given up the chickens, they might have starved. So I think that very much illustrates Forrest's background. And
this program is supported by 3 Feet Radio.
And I think I'll just switch to Grant now, because he's obviously an important figure in the book, and perhaps his background doesn't figure as large because it is well documented. And I'm going to, skip ahead here, but after Forrest, and General Van Doren, they wreck Grant's supply lines, when he was advancing on Vicksburg. Grant seems to take the news very calmly. To me, this says something about Grant, and it says that he didn't get rattled very easily, and I think that sort of comes across in the book. Grant never really got rattled at Shiloh either, and so how do you read Grant's character in that regard?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. He was a person of, he seemed to have, although most people looking at him at the time probably would have wondered why, he seemed to have had absolute faith in himself, and I think the reason was, and I believe that the same thing can pretty much be said of Forrest, and that is that they had faith in the fact that they were going to win, because in both of their minds they could not afford to lose. They came from a class of society where you couldn't lose. I mean, you know, to lose was utter ruin. I mean, it was it was close to death. I mean, and so they never thought about losing. You know, they were going to win. They took victory for granted, and that's why Grant, you know, he never backed up. He never retreated. You know, when almost anybody else would have done so, he never did. And his whole reaction every time he was attacked, his whole reaction was just to counterattack and to try to counterattack with everything he had. And that pretty much was Forrest's way of operating also. Forrest, in fact, you know, he didn't believe in having reserves. He believed that, in fact, he said at one point that after the war, he said that his whole idea had been to try to make the battlefield look as absolutely horrible to the enemy. In his first, you know, when the enemy first came to the battlefield, to make his first sight of it as horrible as he could make it, so that, you know, because Forrest knew that if you could, you know, put fear in the enemy's heart, you won half the battle right there.
And you've just touched upon something I think is a very important part of Forrest's nature, and I think it did come from his background that we have discussed, you know, that sort of cutthroat world where he was at the bottom of, whereby you either succeeded or starved. But psychology plays an important part of Forrest's operations, and a number of times he successfully bluffs Union commanders into surrendering their forces, and he deploys a different number of tricks, such as having the same troops march around an area twice to bluff his enemies into thinking he has a larger force than he does. So, do you want to just elaborate on this a little bit more? Because I think it's such an important part of what or how Forrest conducted himself during the war.
Well, he was an amazingly innovative trickster. He thought of things that nobody else, that would never have occurred to anybody else, or at least never seemed to. I mean, for instance, when he was, you know, on his raid into West Tennessee, when he, you know, he crossed the Tennessee River with about 1,800 men, and he was going into an area there. When he crossed the wide Tennessee River, he was basically, you know, marooning himself in West Tennessee, which was full of federal troops who already knew he was coming and were trying to, you know, find him. And almost any other commander, I think, would have, you know, just snuck into West Tennessee. I mean, you know, just been as unobtrusive as possible. And Forrest comes in telling his men to tell, you know, anybody who asks that they've got, you know, as many men as there are leaves on the trees, and all this sort of thing. So that the first reports that you know, that Grant and the Union commanders got was that he had, you know, well over 10,000 troops instead of you know, 1,800. And then because he knew that, you know, if he was thought to have a lot more men, the Federals would have to figure that they had to get a lot more men themselves together before they attacked him. And in the meantime, that gave him time to just rampage all over West Tennessee, which was basically what he did. But one of the real, you know, the thing to me that really shows what a creative mind he had in that regard was when at some point they captured an outpost, and you know, one of the articles that was there in the place that they captured was a set of kettle drums, and so any other cavalry commander would have, you know, just burned them up along with everything else that they'd captured that they couldn't carry away. But Forrest took them along, and from then on he used them he had his men beat these drums like crazy to make it sound like they had infantry as well as cavalry, and that tricked the Federals, and he also then would when he was releasing prisoners, he would have his men out there beating these kettle drums so that the prisoners, and he would release them usually at night so that they couldn't see what was going on, but they could hear these drums going, and they knew they were just, it sounded like there were, thousands of Forrest troopers instead of just, 2,000.
And just a question, purely a historical one, as someone who has read a bit of military history and someone who comes from, let's say, an Anzac background. When you have researched Forrest, and have you ever sort of felt yourself comparing him to later commanders? And I'm thinking of particularly Erwin Rommel, simply because Rommel used to bluff much like Forrest, and Rommel himself was, I'll call him a relative commoner. I won't go into any more details than that. So have you ever found yourself or others making that kind of comparison?
Well, one of the popular, it may just be a myth, but one of the popular notions about Forrest and Rommel is that Rommel actually came to America between the war to study Forrest, and that he actually came to Mississippi. Now, that's never been authenticated. I mean, and certainly a member of as high a member of the German army as Erwin Rommel would have excited a lot of notice if he had done that, unless he came in some kind of disguise or something. But the fact that his tactics and Forrest's were so similar seems to an awful lot of people not to have been an accident.
Yeah, I can certainly see why people would conclude that. I think I'll have to leave that comparison for another time because it's not specifically covered in your book, and I might even chat to you a bit off air about it if you have the time. But I think the other real strong point for me in the book is both Grant and Forrest spend a lot of their time either dealing with their superiors or people that should have been of equal rank, and that's Forrest. And Grant spends a lot of time dealing with his subordinates who are out to make trouble, either to get rid of Grant or for political reasons. And this has a clear effect on the war. So how much of it did it detract from Grant's waging of the war effort? I'll come back to Forrest in a moment.
I think one of the great things that happened to Grant was when he and Sherman formed their friendship. It made a huge impression on Grant when Sherman, who at the time, when Grant was at Fort Donelson, Sherman outranked him because he had seniority on Grant, and yet he said that he would he sent a note to Grant saying that I will come there and serve under you if you need me there, or I will do anything that I can to help you there. And that just made a huge impression on Grant, and because it was so it was very out of the way. I mean, it didn't happen very often, if ever before. He'd never seen it before, and so awful lot of his superiors and peers had knives out, sticking them in his back at any point they got a chance. And so to have Sherman, and Sherman also was a powerful, he had powerful connections. His brother was a senator, and his father had been high up in the government, and so he was a really powerful person, and so for him to submerge his own future to let Grant call the shots really made a great a great impression on Grant, and Grant was forever grateful for that. And then there was another General James B. McPherson. He was a lieutenant colonel when Grant first knew him, which was at Fort Donelson. And McPherson had been sent there by the higher-ups to check and see how much Grant was drinking. And just, I mean, almost overnight, just in 2 weeks, McPherson became a huge Grant fan. And that was probably no accident, because McPherson was a really, really poor boy also from Ohio, as Grant was. And he almost immediately, as soon as he got to Fort Donelson, he became a Grant admirer, and he, so he didn't tell any tales on Grant, and Grant, he very, very much valued McPherson too. Grant very much valued people who were loyal to him because there were so few of them. But to me, it's significant that these men that he did gather around him. Another one later on was Phil Sheridan. These people all became very, very pivotal figures in the Union war effort. And all of them had come from, down below, except for Sherman, who was not from down below.
If I had to summarize or encapsulate in a question, I think would be a better way of putting it, the way Forrest was treated. And I'm going to ask you, I'm going to put it to you in the form of this question, and I hope you don't mind. But if Forrest hadn't been the victim of Southern snobbery, do you think that he would have taken his place as the cavalry commander at Gettysburg? Now, I know this is a hypothetical question, but I don't really want to sort of be too repetitive in terms of how he was treated, because it's well covered in the book, and it requires quite a bit of time to deal with. So I asked this hypothetical question just to try and illustrate the fact that while the South might not have won the Civil War had Forrest been treated better, they certainly did themselves a disservice.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah. I think that it has been some a lot of mainstream historians have kind of taken the same attitude as the Southern upper crust did about Forrest. I mean, they feel that he never could have been more than what he became, which was he was certainly the best Confederate cavalry commander in the West, and possibly in the Civil War. But people have often really poo-pooed the idea that if he had, been given more influence, that he could have been more than he was. I myself think that he could have, because he obviously had a brilliant mind, and he suffers from a conception that he was a kind of an off-the-wall guy who was uncontrollable, who was a hothead and wouldn't take orders and all this. And I think the book shows that he followed every important order that he got. I mean, it was just toward the end when he began to balk, when his commander Braxton Bragg, who obviously did not like him at all, began to, he had all the way through, he had pretty much demeaned Forrest, and just basically he refused to supply Forrest with any kind of supplies whatsoever. He expected him to take all of them from, on the battlefield from the Federals, because he said that Forrest was an irregular. He was not he wouldn't regard him as a regular cavalry, a regular soldier. And but I think that Forrest, I think Forrest pretty quickly could have learned to lead infantry or whatever he had to. I think if he had been given infantry, he probably would have wound up being something like Stonewall Jackson, who was also, a pretty rough-hewn type, even though he did go to West Point, but he was a real fish out of water there too. Stonewall was, but he was also a kind of inscrutable character who didn't tell anybody his plans and just made his own plans and did them and how he wanted to, and made his men march faster and go farther than anybody else could. And I think Forrest would have been much the same kind of person. I think you said at Gettysburg. I think that under Lee is the one place where he probably could have done well, because Lee it didn't make any difference to Lee who the subordinate was, as long as he got the job done. But that was not the case with most of the other Confederate commanders.
All right, then, and just before we wrap up, I'm going to bring a perspective that isn't specifically in the book, but I think people that aren't Americans should read, and who have an interest in military history, should read this book, because I think the American Civil War, as has been noted by historians, is a kind of forerunner to World War One. So, and when I read the book and the treatment of Forrest, one thing keeps coming back to my mind, and I don't know if it has to the American reader, but the way Forrest was treated was the same way World War One generals, well, at least they're English ones, or British ones if you like, they all came from the ruling class and they had bought their commissions. So, and they were all, well, almost all of them, incompetent to various degrees. And that's encapsulated at the Battle of the Somme, where on the first day the Brits lose 50,000 killed alone. So, do you think that's a sort of valid comparison at all, or is it just someone who is taking a different view of the American Civil War?
I think it probably is a valid comparison. The commanders on both sides of the Civil War, especially the first 2 years of the Union commanders, it was, they were people who were much like what you said, and they were people who just didn't have any conception of how you did things, for example. And Grant and Forrest were men who had barked their knuckles. They had done these things with their own hands, blistered their hands doing manual labor. And so they had a perspective that, for one thing, they knew very well what their men could do and what they couldn't do. And they also, just thought like their men did. I mean, they understood them, and these upper class commanders did not. And in fact, they didn't even try to, most of them. They just regarded them as just, well, cannon fodder, whatever, just to put it out there. Whereas Grant and Forrest, they understood that these people were resources, that these men were resources, and they needed to be, taken care of and husbanded as well as they could do, because, there was not an unlimited supply of them. Now, the Union had more than the Confederacy did, but nobody had an unlimited supply of men.
Yeah, the South runs out of manpower in the end of the American Civil War, which, interestingly, the Germans ran out of manpower in World War I too, but I'll have to save that comparison perhaps for a blog entry So thank you very much for joining us today, Jack. I very much appreciate your time, and I also appreciate that I was able to raise a few points that I weren't specifically mentioned in the book, but since the American Civil War isn't a part of my heritage, I do try and relate to it to events that are a part of Australia and New Zealand's heritage. And one of them is, of course, World War One, and one of them is the war in North Africa and World War Two, where Anzac troops served. So, again, thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this a whole lot.
You have been listening to The Lens of History with Luke Herbert.